Hello everybody. Today we're going to spend some time talking about the different lenses that you can use to take pictures of the night sky and how to choose which one might best fit the photos you're trying to take, because depending on which lens you use, it can have a sometimes dramatic effect on how your picture turns out. So we're going to walk through some different lenses that I've used, show you some example photographs so you can get a sense of how the Milky Way or the other stars are going to look in those pictures at those focal lengths, and how that can impact what you choose to use when you go out to take pictures of the night sky. Let's get started. So I'm going to start with the ultra wide angle lenses, which is where most people start from, and work my way to the longer focal lengths that I have used so far to take pictures of the night sky. Now, before I get into the lenses themselves and examples, let me talk through some of the decisions that you might have to make as you're getting started with your night photography journey, or as you're farther along in the process like I am. I've been taking pictures of the Milky Way and the night sky for about 8 years now. And I started with an ultra wide zoom, a 16 to 28 millimeter f2.8 Tokino lens. And wider angle lenses like that are where most people start from when they're trying to take pictures of the night sky. However, it's very important to get an f2.8 or lower lens. The reason for that is because those will let in enough light in your exposures to be able to capture some decent detail of the night sky. I'm going to back up a little bit and talk about why most people start from an ultra wide angle lens. And that is because they're going to be taking what we call single shot night sky photos. They're going to take one picture, trying to capture as much detail as they can in that one picture, hope they can process it and come out pretty good. What makes it easier to start with a ultra wide lens is because that will allow you to take a longer shutter speed exposure for that single shot without the stars starting to stretch out and turn into blobs and stuff like that. And that's because the Earth is always spinning on its axis, which causes the night sky to always be spinning above us at that speed. And once upon a time, there used to be a concept called the rule of 500. Where you would take 500, divide it by the focal length of your lens, and that would be the longest shutter speed that you could use and still have sharp stars in your night sky image. Say, for example, you had a 20 millimeter lens. For the ease of the math, you would divide 500 by that 20, and the 500 rule said you could shoot with a shutter speed up to 25 seconds, and your stars would still look nice and sharp. But over time, as cameras got higher and higher resolution and lenses got sharper and sharper, that started to not be the case, where the rule of 500 would still leave you with little blobs in your stars, kind of like in this close-up of one of my photos, where the stars are a little bit stretched out and not as sharp as you might want them to be. So somebody came up with something called the NPF rule. And I'm not even sure what that stands for, but basically it's a whole lot of math where you take your camera and your lens and all that, and there's a big formula that will spit out, hey, this is the shutter speed that you should use to keep your stars sharp. Fortunately, there is a tool in the PhotoPills app called Spot Stars, and it will do all that math for you, and I'll show you how it works here. You go into PhotoPills, you click on the Spot Stars tile. You put in at the top what camera you have, you select it from a list, you tell it I'm going to be shooting at this focal length, at this f-stop. If you want to get super detailed, you can tell it, well, how high in the sky or low in the sky am I going to be shooting? And it has all the math built in, and it will spit out an MPF rule shutter speed that you should use. So in this example that I'm showing you here with my Nikon Z8 and a 14mm f2.8, it's telling me 7.73 seconds is the longest shutter speed I should be using for super sharp stars. Say that 3 times fast. Now, what I've found is I can push that a little bit. I can go a little longer than what that MPF rule is spitting out, and I can still get pretty good sharp points for my stars. I tend to go by what I would call the rule of 150 or the rule of 200 instead of the rule of 500. Similar concept. Let's say I'm using my 14-24 zoom at 15mm. Rule of 150, I'm going to divide that 150 by 15. I can get away with 10 seconds probably, and I'll be just fine. But any longer than that, and your stars will start to turn into those blobs. So that is why the easiest starting point for most people is to get themselves an ultra-wide lens to start from. So that's why I started with a 16-28 zoom lens. It was an f2.8. A lot of people will start with a 14-24mm lens like this Sigma that I have now. This is the Sigma Art 14-24mm f2.8 lens. This is an F-mount lens that I adapt to my Z8 using the FTZ2 adapter here. But this lens is a very, very nice choice if you can get it in your lens mount. Awesome lens for photographing the night sky. Now, the reason that you will want to have an f2.8 lens, even an ultra wide angle, is to let in as much light as possible to help with that single shot that you're taking, or maybe if you're doing something else, if you're stacking or tracking, which we'll talk about in a minute, still being able to let in as much light as possible is very useful, because at the end of the day, you can only crank up the ISO on your camera so high before it starts to get really, really noisy, and you have to combat that. We've talked about the shutter speed limitations. So having an f2.8 or better aperture helps you let in light. Now you might be saying, hey, I just bought myself a camera and it came with a lens that's pretty wide. If you bought a crop sensor camera, it might be something like an 18-55mm that's f3.5 to 4.5 or 5.6. If you bought yourself a full frame camera, it might be something like 24-70 f4 or 24-120 f4. Shouldn't that be good enough to start out? And I would say you can try it and give yourself a chance to see if taking pictures of the night sky is something you enjoy. But keep in mind that the difference between f2.8 and f4 is a full stop. And what that means is the f2.8 aperture is letting in twice as much light as the f4, or nearly that for an f3.5. That's a 2/3 of a stop difference. And so, using that f4, that's letting in half as much light. You're already going to be restricted with how high your ISO can go, how long your shutter speed can go. Going back to f4, you're going to struggle to get enough light into your camera without taking some other steps. So that's why I and most people recommend having an f2.8 or lower lens to shoot the night sky with. Another advantage to that is most f2.8 or lower lenses also have higher quality glass to avoid different aberrations that lower quality glass can cause in your night sky photos. So in this 14-24mm range, there's definitely some different steps through this, or with the 16-28mm lens that I had before. So let me show you some examples, and let's talk through what those steps are and how the Milky Way is going to look at those different focal lengths. Now, as I've mentioned, when I first started taking pictures of the night sky, I was using a Tokina 16-28mm f2.8 lens. Often when you're going towards the wider end of a lens like this, you end up going all the way to as wide as it can go. So I have a lot of pictures taken at 16mm. Tamron also makes a 15-30mm f2.8 lens, which a lot of people have used. You'll see a lot of pictures at 15mm from something like that, and now that I have a 14-24mm f2.8 Sigma Art lens, I take a decent number of pictures at the widest end of that at 14mm, just because once you go so far, you end up going all the way to the wide end. Here's one of my very first pictures taken of the Milky Way. at Bear Lake and Rocky Mountain National Park. And of course, this is at 16 millimeters. I also have this picture of Cameron Pass, which is a panorama taken at the 16 millimeter wide end of my lens. Another example is this picture of the Noku Crags by Cameron Pass in Colorado, also taken at 16 millimeters. And in this photo of Lily Lake and Rocky Mountain National Park, I was using the 16 millimeter lens to take vertical photos, which I turned into a vertical panorama, which almost looks like a normal format image because of that. Here we have another photo of the Milky Way at Lily Lake, taken now with the Sigma at 14 millimeters. This vertical shot shows the Milky Way high above Long's Peak. And two of my favorites taken recently at Mount Blue Sky's Summit Lake with the Milky Way over the top of the mountain. Now what you'll notice from all of these is that this wide end of these zoom lenses at 14 or 16 millimeters or 15 millimeters, we have the Tamron, allows you to take in a wide swath of the Milky Way and a lot of the landscape around it. The trade-off to that is that the Milky Way becomes really slender, especially in the area of the core of the galaxy, to where it seems really small in the frame compared to everything else around. And actually, this isn't necessarily a realistic view of it. Sometimes it's worth it to get the shot, like these photos of Mount Blue Sky that are my favorites, but notice that the Milky Way is really thin in these photos. Generally, the next step up into focal length range is somewhere around 20 millimeters. This photo of Loveland Pass is at 20 millimeters. This one over into the Noku Crags again is taken at 21 millimeters. This photo of the night sky over Capitol Reef National Park and its famous barn with moonlight on the rock formation is also taken at 20 millimeters. And this last one of the Roosevelt Arch in Yellowstone National Park was also taken at 20 millimeters. You'll note that the galaxy looks a little bit bigger in the frame. Still quite a bit of the surrounding landscape, but all in all, it's still pretty slender in this wide angle view. A little more detail able to be captured with this longer focal length, but still similar to those 14 or 16 millimeter images, and that the Milky Way is still pretty slender in the sky. You can start to notice a little more detail here and there with nebulas and stuff like that, but overall, still a similar ultra-wide look. This can also be accomplished with some 20 millimeter prime lenses, commonly f1.8s, although sometimes you can find an f1.4. The next step up is at about 24 millimeters. I have this photo of the Milky Way over Long's Peak. At 24 millimeters, you'll notice that the Milky Way is starting to grow in perspective. We're getting a little bit more detail, but still fits in pretty well with the landscape around it. 24 millimeters tends to be a sweet spot for a lot of people. This photo of a historic church out on the plains of Colorado is also at 24 millimeters, which for me happens to be the long end of my Sigma art zoom at 14 to 24. So I take a lot of my 24 millimeter photos with that as opposed to switching to the 24 to 70 lens, just because I tend to be on that longer side anyway if I'm going into 24 millimeters. Here's another example of one that I took in Mayflower Gulch at 24 millimeters. And I also have one that I took that night at 16 millimeters. Compare those two and start to note the difference in size between the thickness of the Milky Way compared to the landscape around it and the detail that can be captured in the galaxy. The wide 16 millimeter view shows a lot of the stretch of the Milky Way, but a lot less fine detail than you'll find at 24 millimeters. And of these two, I tend to prefer the 24 millimeter lens. I do have some interesting photos at 28 millimeters, which was the long end of the range of my old Tokina. This photo of the Milky Way taken from Forest Canyon Overlook in Rocky Mountain National Park, again, has a much more dramatic perspective, in my opinion, than the 16 millimeter taken at basically the same time that night. we're starting to get a lot more detail in the galaxy itself and the gas clouds around it. The trade-off is we're losing some of the landscape below and we're losing some of the upper part of the galaxy. So if you're willing to trade the wider view for getting more detail, this is a good way to go. I also have this photo of the Noku Crags, again up by Cameron Pass. You'll notice the difference between the amount of detail in this shot at 28 millimeters in the core of the galaxy compared to this wider shot at 16 millimeters, taken at basically the same time. There's a lot more going on in the core of the galaxy in this photo than there is in this one. The trade-off again is in the wider shot you get a much wider reach of the Milky Way and more of the surrounding landscape. But the difference in perspective is growing larger as we go. So as you can see, this is really a very versatile range for taking pictures of the night sky. The ultra wide lets you let in a lot of the Milky Way. As you start to get into some of those longer focal lengths, it definitely changes the perspective, but you can still capture a lot of the sky in one shot and a lot of your landscape in one shot, because I like to blend the landscape with my pictures of the night sky to add more interest to it. So moving on from this range, I'm going to pull out this 24 to 70 millimeter f2.8 lens. Now this is an older Tamron lens. I took a lot of pictures of this over the years. This might be what you consider a G1 version of this. There's a second generation of this out for a lot of different camera mounts. I actually have replaced this now with Nikon's 24 to 70 f2.8S Z-mount lens. I'm using that to film with right now on my Nikon ZF. So I'll show you this one as an example. Now in this range, there is a lot of different pictures that you can take. So let's talk through some of those right now. The different focal lengths in here, I'll show you some more examples and we'll talk through the advantages and disadvantages of each one. At this point, I'm going to jump to show some of the photos I've taken with my 35 millimeter prime lens. Yes, that's the next step up for me. And even with my 24 to 70 millimeter zoom, I haven't taken a lot of photos in between that 28 millimeter range as opposed to up to the 35. This one, taken at Clinton Gulch Reservoir near Leadville, Colorado, was one of the first images I took with this photo of the night sky, and the amount of detail really is starting to become dramatic. It fits in well with this landscape, and I really enjoy this photo a lot, and it has been a good seller for me. This photo was taken at the Alpine Visitor Center, high on Trail Ridge Road in Rocky Mountain National Park. Again, the core of the galaxy looms large in the sky, but we still get a decent amount of view of the visitor center itself. I have another example here of a 35 millimeter photo taken on a trail in Rocky Mountain National Park, and compare that to this wider shot taken at 22 millimeters. A much wider view of the scene at 22 millimeters, and you take in more of the galaxy, but the detail in that 35 millimeter image really is pretty nice in my opinion. Now the haze on the horizon in the mid-right of the photo is from wildfire smoke that was in the sky. This was taken in 2021. Here's one I took in Canyonlands National Park. Again, the galaxy looms large in the sky and shows a lot of detail in this very dark sky location. This photo, taken at a historic church on the plains of Colorado, is also at 35 millimeters. Compare that to the follow-up taken at 23 millimeters. A wider sweep of the galaxy over the top of the church, but the detail in this one is really nice. This one here as well, taken at Sprague Lake in Rocky Mountain National Park, is with the 35 millimeter. Although in this photo, the core of the galaxy has slipped below the horizon, there's still a lot of detail to be seen in the gas clouds, and the colors are amazing. Something in this range that I also captured at Capitol Reef National Park was this photo, looking into the core of the galaxy, taken at 32 millimeters. We'll compare that to a wider view taken at 20 millimeters that same night. Again, a lot more of the galaxy in the 20mm shot, but the detail in that 35mm shot is astounding in this international dark sky park. This is where we start to get into some of the longer focal length images that I've taken. This one is at 40mm, taken with my 24-70 f2.8, looking into the galaxy over the top of Long's Peak. This was taken from Lily Lake, but in this image the lake is completely cropped out as we're looking into the core of the galaxy. Here's one taken at 50mm, again over Long's Peak, to the left on the lower side. The core of the galaxy looms large in the sky, and this 50mm really does start to bring out the detail. And since 50mm is close to the perspective of the human eye, this gives you a sense of how big the Milky Way core and the rest of the galaxy really is in the sky. And I'm going to wrap this up by showing a string of images I captured just last month, really focusing on the longer focal lengths. This one of the Milky Way over Long's Peak and Glacier Gorge is taken at 35mm. As I've mentioned already, this is one of my favorite focal lengths, and this is a really nice image. This one, again taken at 50mm. Now the Milky Way is looming large over the top of the peak. We've lost some of that wide breadth of the foreground by using a tighter lens. This one taken with my 50mm prime, but the amount of detail there, despite the light coming in from Denver from the bottom left, is still really nice. And on that night when I was out last month, I decided to put my 24-70 f2.8 lens on and zoom all the way to 70mm because I'd never really tried that before, and see what it would look like. This was the result. A beautiful look into the core of the Milky Way taken over Thatch Top, one of the peaks in Rocky Mountain National Park. I really love the way this one turned out, with all that detail in the core of the galaxy, multiple nebulas visible, and seeing it loom large over the top of the mountain like that is really special. I enjoyed this image a lot more than I thought I would, and I'll probably try this more often going forward. At 70mm, it does get trickier to fit in some part of the landscape with things on the night sky, but I will look for ways to try and make this work going forward. Now, as we get into some of these longer focal lengths, sometimes it can be helpful to switch from a zoom lens, like the first two that I've showed you here, to a prime lens. I'll show you a couple of my favorites. At 35mm, you can often get a 1.8 or even a 1.4 maximum aperture lens. And the difference between that f2.8 lens over there and an f1.8 prime at, say, 35mm is it will let in another 1 1/3, I think, stops of light. So again, more than twice as much. And if you happen to get like a 35mm 1.4 or a 1.2, that's going to let in 2 stops of light or more, which means 4 times as much light at that focal length. This one right here is Nikon's classic 50mm f1.8 lens. And the advantage to some of these 1.8s, a 35mm or a 50 like this, is that they're really small. They don't take up a lot of space in your camera bag. They generally offer some pretty good quality. And like I said, at f1.8, that's letting in more than twice as much light as one of those f2.8 zooms. This 50 gives a really interesting perspective, as I've showed you. It can be used in very limited scenarios, but can be very useful in the right spot for a very dramatic perspective. You can even get 85mm 1.8s or 1.4s or 1.2s to really get tighter shots. But those, like I said, require those to be prime lenses, not zooms. So either you're buying that specifically for this, or you're maybe a portrait shooter or something like that that's going to use them for that as well. Maybe you'll use them for video filming like this, and having that extra light gathering can be really useful. But those are more purpose-driven lenses. An advantage can be a lot of them, especially the 1.8s, aren't that expensive. You can pick up a 50mm 1.8 in Nikon F mount or most others for a couple $100, especially on the used market or refurbished. So they can be a really inexpensive way to get into some of those longer focal lengths. And as I've shown you, the images can be really dramatic. Now, recently, I decided to try my 24 to 70 f2.8 lens all the way at 70 millimeters just to see how it would turn out and see what I could come up with. And with some work, I really liked how that came out. Now, I mentioned when we started that a reason to start with the ultra-wide focal lengths is so you could get everything you need in a single shot and use a longer shutter speed and get away with it. But as you can imagine, as you get to these longer and longer and longer focal lengths, these things get more complicated. That shutter speed has to get shorter and shorter and shorter to keep the stars from dragging. This 50 millimeter, for example, maximum shutter speed time to get sharp stars on this shooting just on your tripod is going to be 3 to 4 seconds. So even then, that f1.8 that's letting in more light, you're still not catching back up to the amount of light that this would gather at f2.8 at a much wider focal length. So how do you combat that? Well, there's one of two ways to go about it. Maybe the simpler one at first is to do a process called stacking, and it's a computer-driven process. And basically how it works is you take a whole bunch of pictures at that shorter shutter speed to keep your stars from trailing, typically anywhere from 10 to 20. And then you take those 10 to 20 pictures and run them through a software that will take them all, align them, work on going through the process of removing noise from those photos as you stack them up. So what that software does is it takes those, let's say 15 photos at 3 seconds that I might have taken with my 50 millimeter lens, and it stacks all that information from all those exposures together, and it makes it as if I had taken roughly a 45-second exposure. It aligns all those photos together so that your stars are sharp. Often it will work out better if you take a separate foreground exposure so that you can line up purely based on the stars, take another picture for your foreground, overlay that over the foreground in your stacked stars image. Typically you would do that at as long a shutter speed as you want because you're not worried about the stars trailing anymore. You could take it at a lower ISO so it's less noisy. And you overlay that on top of your stacked stars image in Photoshop or similar software. And then you can capture more detail than you can in a single shot. That stacking process also eliminates noise that's created from your high ISOs and not capturing as much light. And you can capture a higher quality image that way than in a single shot. Now, this can be a little bit time intensive in processing. You're going to spend some time in front of the computer. Typically, I spend around half an hour per shot to go through, process those 10 to 20 photos, run them through the stacking software, overlay the foreground image on top of the other one, do the regular editing, then after that, process it to the finish line. It's going to take a little bit of time. Another option is to do something called tracking. And basically how that works is, I'm going to pull one of my tripods out here and show you what I have. You have a device that's battery operated that you mount on your tripod, and then you mount your camera on top of that. And it's made to rotate your camera as you're taking a longer exposure to counteract the movement of the stars in the sky so that they will stay sharp on a much longer exposure. So all of a sudden this 50 millimeter, I'm not limited to 3 seconds anymore. Maybe I could shoot for a couple minutes so that I can capture a lot of detail in the sky. So I've got a tripod here, and I'm going to unfold it. So the tracker I have is a Star Adventure Skywatcher Pro. And basically how that works, I have this piece that's mounted on the top of my tripod. Then the tracking device itself mounts to this piece. And you want to, at this point in the process, you would want to align this to the North Star in the night sky because everything in the night sky rotates around the North Star. There we go. And then once you have the tracker on here and you have everything aligned, you would put this piece on the top of the tracker, attach my camera to that, and then take photos. Now, if it sounds like that's a lot more complicated out in the field, you're right, it's more complicated. But once you get used to it, it can be a fairly quick process. I'm going to set this to the side over here. Once you get used to tracking in the field, it can be a fairly quick process to get aligned up to the night sky, set up your tracker, take your photos. And in this case, it speeds the time of processing after the fact, because all of a sudden you've got one image for the stars, which you've been able to shoot at a lower ISO, a longer shutter speed, and still with your aperture wide open. So you've captured a lot more detail in that image. You will have sharp stars. Whew. And obviously your foreground is going to be blurry, so just like with the recommendation with the stacked photos to take a separate foreground exposure, in this case you have to. And I would recommend taking that foreground exposure first before you turn your tracker on and start tilting your camera around as it tracks with the sky. The advantage at that point is you already have your star image straight out of the camera. You don't have to go through the process of stacking. So you have that one tracked image out of the camera, although some people do stack those as well to get even more detail, but that's a whole other level of complication. At this point, we're just going to say we're going to take that one star tracked image out of the camera for the stars. You're going to take that separate foreground photo. You're going to overlay that on top of the tracked sky. Spend a few minutes doing your editing for contrast and color and all those things, and you have your finished product. That typically goes faster for me in less than half the time, maybe even shorter than that, as opposed to dealing with the stacked photos. It is a more complicated process, not necessarily something I would recommend for a beginner, and that is why most beginners, we start them with the single shots at the ultra wide angle lenses, and if they enjoy it, they can be taught how to work their way up from there. But as you can see in some of my examples, those longer focal lengths can give some really dramatic perspectives of the Milky Way as opposed to the wider ones, as long as you can still find some way to mix it with the landscape. Now, which ones of these are my personal favorites? As I mentioned earlier, like everybody else, I started out with an ultra-wide angle zoom to take pictures of the Milky Way because I started out taking single shots just like everybody else. As I gained more experience, I became more comfortable with stacking and eventually got myself a tracker to track. It opened up some doors to get into longer focal lengths, and one that I've come to really enjoy as I've shot quite a few pictures with a 35mm f1.8 prime lens, and I've found that I enjoy that 35mm focal length an awful lot. And the 50mm, this one, in the right spot where I can capture enough of the landscape with the night sky, allows you to really fill up the frame with that Milky Way core like I showed in some of my examples. And that 70mm shot that I shot recently, I really, really like that one. That's getting really tricky at that point to have the core of the Milky Way or whatever you're taking a picture of in the night sky and have that fit with some part of the landscape. Looking into the night sky at 70mm, you saw in that one example, I basically just have a mountaintop of thatch top here in Rocky Mountain National Park, and that's it. Whereas with the 50mm, I still had some of Long's Peak and Glacier Gorge. 35mm, same thing. The wider you go, it's easier to mix it with something else. But that perspective where the Milky Way just keeps getting larger and larger in the frame, the longer focal lengths you go, the longer I'm taking night sky pictures, I'm finding I really enjoy that a lot, and I'm seeking out those kind of compositions as opposed to the wider angle shots. Now your 35s, your 40s, your 50mm lenses, those can also be really nice if you're taking panoramas. That's a different ballgame a little bit, where you're also learning to blend together all the different pictures. Tracking and stacking and doing all that with those can get really complicated, get really time intensive. So a lot of the time when I'm taking panoramas, personally, I just try and do it with single shots. But that's just my choice. But I'm finding that those longer focal lengths are really appealing to me the more and more time that I go on. So That's my personal preference. Everybody enjoys something different. Maybe tell me in the comments which perspectives and different lenses, focal lengths that you enjoyed the most as I went through my examples. Now, if you are looking to learn more about night sky photography, or maybe even get out in the field and try it out in the mountains of Rocky Mountain National Park, I encourage you to join me on one of my night sky photography classes here this year. You'll get a chance to get out with your gear, have personalized instruction, and a chance to capture some amazing photos of the night sky in the amazing environment of Rocky Mountain National Park. Especially as we get up onto the alpine tundra at night, it can be really, really dramatic up there. If night sky photography maybe isn't as much your thing, I also have sunrise photography workshops, and coming up in September, we'll have the fall color and elk rod classes as well. So it's a great opportunity to come out and join me here in the park, put those skills into action and learn some new ones in the beautiful environment of Rocky Mountain National Park, where I'm at today filming this video. And the mosquitoes are assaulting me. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, hit that like button, share it with your friends, maybe subscribe to the channel. I would appreciate it a lot. And I'll see you in the next video.